make sure they look at Josh.
He was cornered.
Hi, Susan. We haven't seen or heard from you. So something tragic has happened.
Hey, I'm Dave Cawley. I am the host of the podcast Cold, and I'm here with Becky Bruce.
Hello.
To answer your questions. This is our second Facebook Live, and we're excited to talk about the podcast. Any questions you might have about what you've heard so far? Hey, I'm Dave
Hop
Cawley.
on and give
I
us
am
an
the
ask.
host
Yeah,
of the
Becky,
podcast Cold,
why
and
don't
I'm
you
here
start
with
us
Becky
off? What's on your
Bruce.
mind?
Well,
to
episode
answer your
4,
questions, this is our
so we've
second
done
Facebook
one of these
Live,
already
and
where
we're
we
excited
covered
to
extensively
talk about
episode
the podcast. Any
3.
questions
So
you
I
might
really
have
wanted
about
to
what
zero
you've
in
heard
on
so
episode
far?
4.
Hey, I'm Dave
Hop
Cawley.
on and give
I
us
am
an
the
ask.
host of the
Becky,
podcast Cold, and I'm here with Becky Bruce.
Well, episode 4, so we've done one of these already where we covered extensively episode 3. So I really wanted to zero in on episode 4.
Hey, I'm Dave
Hop
Cawley.
on and give us an
I am the
ask.
host of the
Becky,
podcast Cold, and I'm here with Becky Bruce.
Well,
Over the course of the last probably year and a half, I reached out to him after I'd done kind of my primary research to see if I couldn't get a more personal take on the police investigation. And when we first met, he came here to the broadcast house at KSL, and we sat outside on the porch on a kind of a bright summer day. He came dressed in a full suit. I mean, he presented himself as a very professional guy, and I could tell that he was not particularly savvy at that time about the whole broadcast, news industry. I don't think he had a lot of experience dealing with that as a detective. For people that don't know, police usually have a spokesperson who kind of is the face for the organization while all of the actual police officers are doing their job. So we kind of felt each other out during that first meeting, and then several conversations along the way. Ellis strikes me as a very thoughtful guy. There was never a point in any of our conversations where I asked him a question where he would just tell me he wasn't going to answer that without good reason. I mean, there are a few things that in this case are actually still under a court seal. And
primarily in Washington.
More so when you get into some of the federal stuff. So and to explain that a little bit, they get in later into the investigation into some electronic surveillance and things like that. That entails some federal warrants and things like that. So they want to make sure that they're not getting wrong on the side of the FBI or the U.S. Marshals or any of that. But for the most part, very candid. Strikes me as very down to earth. Personally, I enjoyed the time that I spent talking to him. And there are certainly places in the investigation where I think it's fair to look at the decisions that the police made and to be critical of those decisions. And I feel like Ellis owns those pretty well. And my intent in presenting him the way that I did in episode 4 of the podcast is to let the listener kind of get to know him a little bit and then ultimately make their own decision about how they feel he approached the case.
Well, and you mentioned getting to know him a little bit. We even get to know a little bit about what it was like to grow up Ellis Maxwell. Why did you decide to do that deep of a look back at his life?
Yeah. Ellis is a human being, right? And he was deeply involved in this investigation. He wanted as much as anybody to find Susan. I believe that. I believe that he was firmly invested in finding answers in this case. But understanding where he comes from and the way he thinks, I think, are important to see how he makes decisions later on in the story. So, going back and really explaining why he was driven to become a police officer, his kind of persistence and path in getting there, and the way in which, I think he has a drive to become a police officer and is dealt with setbacks, and his way of dealing with those setbacks is to continually push until he gets to the place he wants to be. And I think that comes through again when he picks up this case.
Do you think he has any idea what happened to Susan?
I asked him that question fairly recently. You must have theories, right, Ellis? And he kind of smiled and looked sideways and then told me, yeah, I have theories, and they'll be in my book. Which Ellis was upfront with me from the very first time that we talked that he's working on a book, and he hopes to have that finished probably within the next year. And he'll include some things that didn't even come up in our conversation. His perspective on the case beginning to end. I told him, and I mean it, that I'm very interested to read it. And he also is working as a private investigator and doing some other work. So I know he's juggling a lot of things right now.
Yeah. When did he first realize this missing persons case wasn't just a typical missing persons case, this welfare check that wasn't?
Right. So, I mean, if you go back to the timeline, which, by the way, we're tweeting out a live timeline of the events of December 7th of 2009 right now on the Cold Podcast Twitter account, because today is the 9th anniversary of Susan's disappearance. You'll see that Ellis received the assignment to pick up this case in like the 1 o'clock, 1:30 time frame. He ends up out at the house after 2, and then he doesn't speak with Josh until after 5 o'clock when he uses Josh's sister's cell phone to call Josh, and he can already tell that this is a little strange, that Josh is not acting normally. And then when Josh comes back to the house at about 6:40 p.m. and is obviously not answering questions, is kind of dodging Ellis, you know, he's already starting to pick up the cues. He sees a charger plugged in the minivan, even though Josh is telling him right that second that, you know, he turned his phone off because the battery was going to die. So he's picking up a sense right from the beginning that something's off. And then I think if you listen to episode 4, where you hear that first interview that Ellis did with Josh, it becomes clear, I mean, from the first minute, that this is pretty strange.
Yeah. Well, it is the anniversary of the family being reported missing. The last time anybody saw Susan alive would have been December 6th.
Yep.
We think maybe about 4:15 when she said she was tired and went and laid down. What about the timeline from December 7th as you've recreated kind of all of this and looked at the facts? What stands out to you?
Without giving too much away, because this will come up in great detail in episode 5, Josh's movements on the 7th after he returns from the Pony Express trail. So Josh is basically unaccounted for until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he takes his first phone call from Giovanna Owings' son, who was at times a babysitter for the Powells. It's a question as to whether or not Josh recognized that phone number, why he answered that phone call in particular. But that phone call he took, he was in West Valley. And
you know that because...
You know that because it went through a cell tower near his house, not too far from his house. Few people know this. And again, I'll go into a lot more detail about this, but that's a little preview of what's coming up Wednesday in episode 5. Yeah, Josh's movements, what the police were able to learn about where he was using his cell phone records, I think will surprise a lot of people, because it shows that right from the very beginning, Josh was not being truthful about where he said he was.
Some other questions I have for you. What did Ellis find most challenging about dealing with Josh Powell? I mean, obviously, there's some stuff we can call him on in terms of facts right there.
Yeah. So you've listened to the podcast.
I have.
I've had a couple of people tell me their experience listening to that first interview is wanting to jump across the room and grab Josh and shake him by the shoulders, because you can tell he's not being forthcoming.
Right.
But
I guess there are reasons why investigatively you wouldn't want to jump across the table and do that.
Certainly. Ellis's tactic as a detective, and he describes this, is to get Josh's statement, and anything that Josh says that sounds like it's not true, you set that aside, you tuck it away, and then you bring it back up later again, and you challenge the person with that, why that statement isn't factual, and then make them explain it. The trick is, when he tries to do that with Josh, throughout the whole rest of this investigation, Josh invokes his right basically to have an attorney present, or essentially his right to remain silent. So they try to read him his Miranda rights on Tuesday, the next day, and Josh says, I don't know, maybe I need a lawyer. So Josh was obviously very clever about how he answered the questions that the police, particularly Ellis, were posing to him. And, Ellis is working within a set of rules based on, the laws that we have in this country about whether or not you can force somebody, essentially, to give a statement.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit about that, because that's something that we get a lot on our podcast, in Facebook, and other forums as well. People will ask us, why didn't he just go ahead and arrest him? And they seem very frustrated by that. I think what you didn't hear Ellis necessarily say in episode 4, but what he's sort of hinting at is there's a difference between probable cause and what he had at that moment. What did he have at that moment?
Right. So if you think about the standards that police have to operate under, various levels depending on what you're talking about. If you're going to arrest somebody, if you are going to go get a warrant, you typically have to establish what they call probable cause. So you have to be able to explain, essentially to a judge, this is why we are detaining this person, this is why we are seizing items, why we're taking particular things, right? You can't just walk into somebody's home as a police officer and say, I think something happened here, I'm going to take this, this, and this.
You have to have some spelled out reasons.
Right. So this idea of probable cause. Now, there's a lesser standard called reasonable suspicion that comes into play in some other situations, but ultimately, if you're going to arrest Josh, you have to be able to clearly explain why you think he's responsible of a crime. And there's mounting circumstantial evidence in this case from the beginning, and you could draft a statement of probable cause based on circumstantial evidence, but it's going to be a heck of a lot stronger if you have some very solid physical evidence, even if it's not a body. You have to be able to explain what you believe happened to Susan. And to this day, aside from the fact that she's disappeared and is presumed to be dead, I don't know that anyone can definitively say what they believe happened to her.
But now in episode 3, we were talking a lot about how sick she was feeling. Was she poisoned?
Good question, right? I'm painting the picture based on what we discovered in Susan's emails, in her journal, what police learned from talking to her friends, what I learned from talking to her friends and family. And I think it's reasonable to draw the conclusion that poisoning is a potential, but there again, the physical evidence that we have available didn't give anything definitive, and this will come up again in the future episodes, because the police certainly had that theory, but
they couldn't prove it.
And we're working hard to try to confirm it.
I see.
Yeah.
Why was it a big deal that the boys were present at that first police interview?
Oh my gosh. So if you listen to that tape, you constantly hear, especially Charlie, but both Charlie and Braden talking in the background. And Josh will hear a question from Ellis, and then his boys will be saying something, and Josh will ignore what Ellis told him so that he can turn his attention to his boys. And this happens over and over again. At one point in the interview, they do bring a victim advocate in to basically sit with the boys and kind of occupy their attention and take care of them while Ellis is focusing on talking to Josh. But as Ellis mentioned in episode 4, Josh was not comfortable with a police officer sitting there, or a victim advocate sitting there and talking to his boys, and so it kind of distracted him even more. You'll see what happens in episode 5 on Wednesday when Ellis and Josh sit down again. This time the boys aren't there, and in fact they're starting to make some pretty interesting statements.
Yeah. Does Ellis have any big regrets about the case?
He seems to. I mean, I think like anybody else, Ellis wishes this had all ended very differently. Ideally, he would have been able to arrest Josh, find Susan, and that the boys would have been protected, right? I think he's very reflective about the decisions that were made along the way. The sense that I seem to get from Ellis is that he can't find a single aha moment in the past where he looks back and goes, that was the one thing that turned it. that maybe if I'd done this or that differently. But yeah, I mean, anybody who went through what he and the rest of the West Valley Police Major Crimes Unit went through, and even beyond that, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, all these people that were investigating this, you know, I don't think it's safe to say that any of them wanted to see this end up the way it did.
Are we going to hear anything else about that wet spot on the floor or the sofa?
Oh yeah. Yeah, a lot of that. I mean, that goes back to the very early news reports. I mean, we were hearing these reports from the very beginning when the police went in, and word of mouth was getting around in that first few days after Susan's disappearance that there was this, you know, these fans on and the carpet had been cleaned. So Ellis, of course, mentioned, yeah, we saw the fan, I saw the couch had been cleaned. In episode 5, you're going to hear what happens once the police do get that warrant. They go back to the house. Now they have the legal authority to actually really start digging into it. And the discoveries that they make on and around the couch are pretty interesting.
Let's go back for just a moment to the initial reports, how we first found out that Susan and her family were all missing.
Yeah.
And what sort of set in motion the investigation. Does it all go back to the babysitter?
Yeah, Debbie, she, I think, I don't think Josh liked her very much after December 7th. You know, if you look back at her logs, which I've had a chance to review, you can see she was very diligent in recording the times that the Powell boys would show up. And so she would mark the time on there, whoever dropped them off, if it was Josh or Susan, they signed on her log. When they came to pick them up in the afternoon, they signed the log out. And it's very consistent that it's about 6:40, 6:45 a.m. that the boys are dropped off there, because Susan then has to get to work at Wells Fargo by like 7 a.m. And they were very good about that. So you can imagine when the boys don't show up that morning that it's very unusual. And Debbie and Susan have a very good relationship. You know, they communicate outside of just the daycare about life and things. And so Debbie's concerned, but then you also have to factor in that there's bad weather at play. And she kind of sets it aside a little bit until, you know, about 8 o'clock in the morning, when it becomes very clear that by now she should have heard something. And so she starts making those phone calls, and she visits the house while doing the run with the rest of her kids to take them to school. She recognizes that the situation's not right. She pulls out the emergency contact list and identifies Josh's sister Jennifer, and calls and leaves a message for Jennifer. Hears back a little bit later from Josh's mom, Theresa, that she and Jennifer are on their way to the house, and that really kicked this whole thing into motion. If Debbie had not recognized early that morning that something was amiss, it potentially could have been, until Tuesday, maybe even, before somebody thought, you know, it's weird that Susan didn't show up for work. What's going on? So, yeah, she definitely sounded the alarm early, and I think Josh was surprised when he arrived back from his camping trip to learn that the alarm had already been sounded.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who helps to manage other people on occasion, I can't imagine having an employee do a no-call, no-show and not doing some kind of follow-up. So we heard some of those voicemails.
Yep.
There was one on Susan's phone from Josh's boss going, "Hey, hope everything's okay." Do you think somebody else might have sounded that alarm if Debbie hadn't?
It's possible. Yeah, it's certainly possible. But Debbie, maybe more than most people, was in a position to understand what was going on in Susan's private life. You know, certainly Josh's boss isn't going to have as intimate a knowledge as some of Susan's close friends about some of those kinds of things, and so I think her sense of the situation was a little more fine-tuned than most other people's.
What happens after she gets in touch with Jennifer Graves? Is that when we start getting the 911 call and sort of the police activity at the house?
Yeah, so I mean, you get the officers who responding to that 911 call, I mean, within minutes, right, are at the house, and they're seeing the same things that Debbie saw, the lack of, you know, tracks. They see Debbie's tracks, but they can't see, you know, tracks coming out of the garage from a vehicle being backed out. They notice that all the windows are covered, the doors are all locked. And some of the visual cues, I mean, they're noticing that the blinds in front of the windows in front of the house are fluttering. And there was that real sense that carbon monoxide might have been a problem inside the house. The heater, the furnace might have been putting off gas that could have knocked the whole family unconscious. And how would they know unless they could get inside the house to really check that out? And so ultimately that decision was made that the police would use the baton to knock out the window right next to the front door and wriggle their way through and unlock from the inside. And once they get in there and they realize nobody's home and the van's gone, that's when it starts getting really curious.
I'm curious if there's any indication why there's such a gap between the 911 call and when they finally broke the window. I know just from having helped set up that Twitter timeline that's going on right now, the 911 call is at 9:53, and I think they break the window at 11:39.
Yeah.
That seems like a long time if you really think that the family might be in danger.
It is a long time. So, look at what the police are doing in that meantime, and the rest of the friends too. So they start calling everybody, right? So call all of their workplaces, identify any friends and family you can, and start calling them. Start knocking on doors in the neighborhood. So, Jennifer is going door to door, knocking on doors to see if any of the neighbors know where Josh, Susan, and the boys might be. And there's also some reluctance. For anyone who's listened to the podcast in, the first 3 episodes, I feel like you should have a pretty clear sense that Josh is fiscally tight. Let's put it that way. And the police don't want to do any physical damage to property unless they have an absolute need to. But they know they need to do that. And they're asking Josh's mom, are you okay? I mean, do you think it's okay if we essentially break this window to climb in there? And she's not sure. Terry takes some time to make that decision. So I think that was a large part of it as well.
I want to get back to the day of the disappearance in a second, but we did have another listener question on Facebook, which is what happened to the insurance money? That's complicated.
Oh, my. Yes. So hopefully we've set the groundwork well enough that you can kind of see the picture, right? Josh has a $1 million term life insurance policy on Susan. He has established the legal framework to take control of that money should something happen to Susan through the trust that they created in February of 2009. Police don't find out about that right away. It's kind of information that develops through December, and they learn about the power of attorney and some of these other things as Josh tries to draw out Susan's retirement account. We'll get into that. And then not a lot seems to happen on the surface until much, much later in the story. Just to skip ahead to try to answer the question without giving too much away, the insurance money became a huge fight in the federal court system. It was the subject of ongoing litigation between Susan's parents and Josh's mom and sister, and up until his death, his brother Michael. Ultimately, that was settled and the money was split. A large portion of it went to the Coxes, and a good portion of it went to the estate of Josh's brother Michael as well.
Another listener question for you, which is, what about the letter that Susan left at work?
Yeah, so I mean, those 2 pieces of evidence, right? The deposition that she told her friend Kiersey all about this fight, and then the next day she went and wrote out that handwritten will. I talked extensively to Ellis about that will because when I first saw that in her own handwriting and read that, it kind of blew me away. We had heard about the will after the case kind of went cold. Some of those pieces of evidence that the police had but not really talked about started to filter out a little bit. Ellis told me they kept that very quiet. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, they found out about that probably the day after the disappearance, and they were able to retrieve it using a subpoena about a week later. So within a week, they had that will. They had Susan's own words saying that if anything happened to her, Josh was probably responsible, and that they should check with her friends and family to ask what was really going on in her life. But the police chose to keep that very, very confidential. They didn't even tell Susan's parents that they had that because they considered it one of their strongest pieces of evidence, and they didn't want word of it getting out and spreading around, because then when they went to present that potentially at a trial, the impact would have been pretty much watered down.
Is it possible she was influenced to stay in the relationship because of religious beliefs?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think Susan's decision to stay in the relationship with Josh involved a lot of different factors. Her faith was certainly one. You know, she had a deep desire to have Josh return to the person she thought he was when they married, which was a faithful member of her church, somebody who was living the religion, adhering to the same sense of standards that she was. And of course, for people who know the way Latter-day Saints look at marriage, a temple marriage is considered to be sacred. It's a marriage for time and all eternity, not until death do you part. And so there is, I think, a larger sense of purpose for Susan as she considers divorce, in that she's considering ramifications that would extend forever. That's very heavy. That's very heavy. But that was not the only reason. I think if you look at some of her fear, she expresses concern that Josh would do something to her were she try to divorce him, that he would take the kids. Susan obviously has an idea of what Steve Powell did to Josh's mom when they divorced. And so there are a lot of considerations that I think are in the back of her mind as she's considering divorce.
How did you go about getting all of the case information?
Yeah, so, I mean, we received the bulk of what I've kind of called the redacted case file in 2013. The police spent a lot of time going through their files and blacking out what they considered to be personally identifiable information. So, you know, a lot of these reports, they'll have someone's name, address, phone number, birth date, all that kind of stuff. If you're not somebody who is directly tied to the case, they didn't want to just blast that information out publicly. So they went through and blacked out a lot of that information. They took out a lot of the multimedia, so a lot of the video and audio recordings that they had made. But they provided a flash drive, a 30 gig flash drive with a lot of this information on it to us in 2013. So that kind of became the bedrock that we started building on. Becky, you and I, very early on, were both involved in kind of sorting through that, figuring out what was there, what had not been reported yet. We identified materials that had not been released, some of those recordings, for instance, and submitted new public records requests asking for those specific items, because there had been efforts made by Susan's parents and other people to get a complete unredacted version of the case file released, and those had been successful. So, you know, we kind of identified our strategy as being, let's look for specific items that we think would be valuable to shedding new light, and went after those. And as we picked up individual pieces along the way, it led us to more and more places to go.
Would a lot of that information have been available to the public? For example, that original 2013 document dump, was that something that just anybody could go get?
Potentially, yeah. In the state of Utah, there's a law, the Government Records Access and Management Act, GRAMA as we call it. And under GRAMA, the public has a right to review or receive copies of public documents. And so while this case was being actively investigated, there's an exclusion under GRAMA that basically says if this is an active case and release of this information would compromise the investigation, they can withhold it. But once they declared the case cold, there was really not much reason anymore to withhold release of those documents. So yes, an average person can certainly sit down, fill out a GRAMA request form, provide it to the agency and ask for those records. But if you don't know what you're asking for, or some of the kind of legal ins and outs of the way that works, it can be sometimes difficult to get cooperation from the agency because there are any number of exclusions or fees or timelines that come into play on that.
How closely did investigators question the boys, and would they have considered that information credible?
Yeah, so the interview with Charlie Powell that detective did on December 8th, so the day after the disappearance, it also was a pretty big piece of evidence. And in episode 5, you're going to hear how Detective Ellis Maxwell confronted Josh with the information that Charlie provided to a detective on that day, and essentially what that did through the whole course of the investigation. There's good reason to believe that Josh did not take well to the police having questioned the boys, and that was not the only time that they talked to Charlie and Braden. So they certainly were trying to develop whatever leads they could out of the boys. However, once that first few days was over with, it became increasingly more difficult because Charlie and Braden were with their dad. They were under the influence of Josh and Steve, and I think there's pretty good reason to believe that they had been groomed in the responses that they later gave.
Is there video evidence from the car wash where Josh took his minivan after his trip to the West Desert?
No, there's not, and they did try to go get it. If you look at the Cold Podcast website, there's a really goofy looking video of me sitting in the back of my car at the car wash, trying to go look myself to see, hey, would you have been able to see anything here? And you know, it's just kind of the corner car wash. There's no video surveillance or anything like that there that was available to the police.
Did any stores have any video evidence of him buying all that camping gear?
Yeah, again, so the origin of all that weird camping gear, if you look at it, I think he had that for a while. I don't think he bought that right before the trip, because there's a video in 2008 when Susan's considering divorce where she goes through the house and is cataloging all of their possessions, and she makes reference to, hey, here's some totes of camping supplies. So I believe that Josh had probably purchased those earlier, that he'd had them for a while. But to the question of, you know, looking at his financial records, trying to see what he was buying, police did get access to his checking account, to his bank records, his credit cards. So they were able to look and see, in a lot of cases, where he was spending money, if not exactly what he was buying at particular times.
I think I speak for every parent out there with this next question, which is, who in the world takes a 4 and a 2-year-old out to the middle of the desert in a snowstorm and goes camping?
Yeah.
But you believe that there is at least some reason to believe that that happened. Why do you think that?
Yeah, so we know that for a couple of reasons. First is that Josh had done it before. So, and you'll hear a detailed account of this coming up in a future episode, but in May of 2009, Josh, Susan, and the boys went for a camping trip out on the Pony Express Trail. They visited Simpson Springs, they visited the Dugway Geode Beds, Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge, so places that would be familiar to anyone who's traveled down the Pony Express Trail before. But if you rewind even further and go back to March, Susan makes reference in emails to Josh taking the boys out for a similar camping trip on the Pony Express Trail and coming back home midway through the night because the boys got too cold. And when he went to take the boys out again in December, he brought space heaters and a portable gas-powered generator, presumably to power those space heaters. So he had recognized that taking the boys out in the cold and making them sleep in the car without some source of secondary heat was not a good idea. Josh was paranoid about running the car and using the heater from the car because he was afraid of the boys being overcome by fumes, sleeping in the car that way and passing away. So yeah, that's essentially the reason why I think he was being truthful about taking the boys out there.
He's paranoid about the boys succumbing to fumes in the car, but he took his own life and killed the boys later. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to explain why Josh did what he did, but he did make these references in his writings to, you know, being a young man and his mom telling him, hey, don't ever sleep in a car while it's idling because, you know, you could pass out and never wake up. So we know that was a fear that he had. He mentioned that specifically to Ellis Maxwell in one of their interviews, talking about why he had the space heaters and the generator in the car. Wouldn't there have been a concern that the generator or the space heaters could do the same thing?
Well, space heaters would be electric, and he had an extension cord. So presumably, when he gets to where he's camping on the Pony Express Trail, he takes one of the tarps that he has, he spreads that out on the ground, he sets the generator outside the car on that tarp, and then runs the extension cord into the van to power the electric space heaters in there.
Having now seen from the Cold website the pictures of some of the stuff from inside the van, I'm having a hard time picturing it having even the smallest amount of room to put a space heater.
It's pretty packed in there. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the way stuff was loaded up into that van, when Josh came back from the Pony Express Trail on December 7th, there was not a lot of room. You know, you've got the car seats for the boys in the middle row. The whole back of the van is filled up with
the totes,
the generator. He brought a humidifier, the space heater, you know, shovel, broom, an electric circular saw, like a power saw, a folding hand saw, which are both very curious items to have brought camping with him. And, you know, it's worth pointing out there as well that there would not have been a lot of room for Susan to be in the back of the van either. So that's one of those things that you kind of have to take in consideration when you wonder, you know, did he bring her out to the Pony Express Trail with him?
Right. I know that you've been investigating this case for a while now, and it was only within the last half a year that Susan Powell passed away. Were you able to reach him before he died?
No, tried. When he was still in prison, I wrote him a letter basically explaining who I was, what I was doing, and didn't receive a response to that. He was released a short time later, and as I understand it, was for a time in a halfway house up in Washington State. Washington's sex offender law, because at that point Steve was a registered sex offender, does not provide a direct address for sex offenders who are being monitored. So I knew roughly the block in Tacoma that he was on, and I did visit that area once looking to see if I could figure out where he was living. I wasn't able to do that. Tried to find a phone number for him, but all of his pre-existing phone numbers didn't go through anymore. The lines have been disconnected, so ultimately was not able to get in touch with him before he died.
Another listener question for you, which is, did you ever get into the drawing of Mommy in the Back?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting drawings that Charlie made, and we will certainly spend some significant time looking at Charlie's interactions both at Carson Elementary School in Puyallup and at the YMCA, where he was having some conversations with staff members and things like that. You know, again, you go back to the point that by that point in time, Charlie had been hearing media. You know, he'd been hearing his dad, his grandpa, his uncle, his aunt talk about some of these things, and so how much relevance you can put on that, I think it's pretty tough.
Sure. Do you think Michael was involved?
Yes.
So for people who don't know, I'll
Yes.
break the fourth wall here a little bit. Michael is Josh's younger brother.
His youngest brother.
Okay.
So
Tell us a little bit about Michael.
Josh has two brothers. He has a brother, John, who is very close in age, and then his youngest brother, Michael, is he's a bit different. So if you look at Michael, he kind of sits in the background of this story for a very long time. But he was involved from very early on. We know that the Thursday after Susan disappeared, he was at the vigil with Josh and the boys, and this would have been after Josh showed up from his trip in a rental car where he put 800 unexplained miles in the car in 18 hours. Michael helped Josh move out of his house. He helped Josh drive his U-Haul up to Washington in early January, and they had a relationship that went back several years. I've mentioned in one of the episodes already that Michael ran for the legislature in Washington State at one point. Josh helped build his website. So they stayed in touch, and I think you'll see through the course of the story that even after Michael himself leaves Washington and is pursuing a PhD program in Minneapolis, that he and Josh stayed in contact, and they were using technology that was encrypted to try to prevent law enforcement from listening to their conversations.
That's pretty high tech.
Yeah, I mean, in today's smartphone age, we have end-to-end encryption on a lot of our messaging, right? If you use iMessage, for example, with Apple, all of those messages are encrypted device to device. So this is an ongoing fight that we see playing out in our legal system right now, where law enforcement wants a back door to be able to get in and monitor those kinds of conversations for exactly this kind of reason, because when you have potentially a conspiracy going on, and you have technology that allows the conspirators to communicate outside of the ability of law enforcement to listen in with a warrant, that raises some serious concerns.
Two questions directly related to that time period when Josh says he was camping. One is there any financial activity, evidence that Josh used, for example, debit cards, credit cards, whatever, during that time when the family was missing, between,
Right.
5 o'clock the night before and 6:40 when he finally shows back up?
No, and it's conspicuous because if you look at Josh's cell phone and his financial records, they both go silent. So, Josh goes to Winco on Sunday, sometime around noon. He buys the ingredients for the lunch, the pancake lunch that he's making for Susan and Giovanna. And then his financial activity stops. He talks to his dad on his phone about a recipe, supposedly, for this pancake lunch, and then his phone activity stops. And you don't see that pick up again until 3 o'clock and after on Monday afternoon. So they both were silent through that time.
And so that kind of confirms the second question I was about to ask, which was, were they able to ping Josh's cell phone while he was in the desert?
Right. So for anybody who's ever been out to the Pony Express Trail, you know that once you basically go over Lookout Pass, cell signals get a little spotty because there's not a whole lot out there. There's no good reason for a cell phone provider to stick a tower in a lot of those areas. Dugway Proving Ground is about the last outpost until you get pretty much almost all the way to Wendover. It's really unlikely that you would pick up cell service. So A, there are no towers really for Josh's cell phone to connect to, and B, he has his cell phone turned off, and we learned in episode 4 that he also had Susan's cell phone with him. That was turned off, and curious that when Ellis took Susan's cell phone from the van that night, they later learned that the SIM card had been removed. So, it wouldn't have operated connected to a tower even if it had been turned on without that SIM card.
Sure.
No way to ping it.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, the discovery of that cell phone was the aha moment of the episode, where they went, what? Is that something that had been widely reported before?
Yeah, I'm not sure how well known that was. Certainly, it was in the police case file records. Ellis makes mention of it in his detailed reports, but I don't think they made a big deal about it publicly when that happened. And it was enough that when I was having that interview with Ellis and we were talking about that, the way he described it happening, it sure seemed to me like that was the moment where you'd think, we got him, arrest this guy right now and take him to jail. And so, I did ask him at that very moment, why didn't you arrest Josh there? And, his episode, or his answer played out in the episode.
Yeah. We do have somebody who's asking, where is Michael now? And I know the answer to that, but for people who don't.
Yeah, Michael took his own life in 2013 by jumping off the parking terrace of the building in Minneapolis where he was living. So he had bought a condo and was living there while attending university, and the police had started to focus pretty closely on Michael once Josh killed himself and the boys, as he was kind of their last good lead, and Michael didn't leave any kind of a note or anything to explain why he did what he did, but the presumption is that he felt some strong guilt about what he either knew or had taken part in, and that motivated his decision to end his life.
Why don't we hear so much about the other two Powell siblings? We talk quite a bit about Jennifer. Obviously, Josh is central to the story.
Yeah.
What about John and Alina?
So John, there are concerns regarding John's mental state. Without getting too much into his personal information, you know, he had at times in his life been institutionalized, and so suffice it to say that law enforcement didn't think that he would be a reliable source of information, or that that he was entrusted with any information by other family members who might have known. Alina, you will hear more from. She becomes pretty vocal once Josh is back in Washington State and is involved with the court system up there fighting for the boys. She pretty much became primary caretaker for Charlie and Braden once Josh moved them up there. So she kind of took over as the surrogate mother, I think, inside the Powell household with the boys. She was involved in taking them to school a lot and interacting with you know, teachers and faculty members up in Washington State. And she made some pretty strong accusations against the West Valley Police Department and Pierce County Sheriff's Office about their handling of the investigation after Josh died as well. So that's to come.
Sure. I know one of the things that you did as part of this past episode was try to retrace the steps that Josh says he took.
Yeah.
Visiting the West Desert and then going down south through Lehigh and back up was, I believe, the claim.
Mm-hmm.
Does his timeline check out?
It does. Yeah, I mean, that's the crazy thing, right?
Because we know he's lying about part of it, so it's just odd that...
So, and I'll get into this a little bit, but there's a sense of the best lie is the one that is built on the truth. So if you can tell enough truth around your lie that it makes it difficult to, you know, extract the lie from the rest of the accurate information, it's going to be a lot harder to detect than just a, you know, bald-faced lie that's obviously on its face false. So, yeah, I about a year ago, I went out to Sarah Circle. I parked in the cul-de-sac there, and I waited around until about the time that Josh said he was leaving, and felt pretty self-conscious about it because, you know, this is a neighborhood where people live, and here I am just creeping in my car for a while. But then I drove the route that he said he took out to I-80, down through Tooele, over you know, the pass onto the Pony Express Trail out to about 20 miles down the road, just shy of Simpson Springs. We don't know where exactly Josh pitched his camp because he was evasive about answering that. So I kind of made my own best guess about this looks like a place where you might want to camp. Slept in the back of my car there until about 7 in the morning. It was about 3 hours of sleep. It was a pretty short night. Drove out to Simpson Springs and then took his route back home. Stopped at the car wash and did that whole route. So yeah, the timeline that he described, it worked out perfectly.
I've been on the Pony Express Trail. My family likes to go play with rocks and sleep in the dirt and all that stuff. I wouldn't have taken my minivan out there when I had a minivan. Is that feasible?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it kind of depends, right? So the Pony Express Trail road is dirt and gravel, and the way it works out in the desert there is as long as the weather's dry and you don't have too much traffic that's, you know, going through it when it's muddy and stuff, it'll stay pretty smooth. I've been down there before where I was, you know, 40, 50 miles an hour comfortably in a car with no problems. But on the flip side, if it's been wet and people have torn through there and you know, left deep ruts in the mud or anything like that, it could certainly slow you down where you wouldn't have, you know, the high clearance or you know, the tire tread to be able to navigate through some of that. So it's really condition dependent. Depends on how recently the road had been graded, whether or not it'd be, you know, really washboarded. We know that when Josh and Susan took the boys out there in May of 2009, they actually blew a tire because it's pretty rocky, right?
Yeah.
So it would have been a risky, I think, proposition for Josh to.
But doable?
Doable, yeah, certainly doable. But you know, if you were carrying incriminating evidence and you knew in the back of your mind that the last time you came down here, you blew a tire out and somebody stopped to help you, you might not want to take that risk.
Do you think Susan's body will ever be found?
I sure hope so. We've all waited a very long time, and I think that the best ending to the story that we could possibly hope for now would be some kind of conclusion that would give her family a sense of knowing what happened to her and an ability to put her body to rest alongside her boys. That being said, the area in which she could be is so large that any type of an organized search without a better lead pointing in a specific direction, it's a very tall task. So I tend to think that if it happens, it will probably be through random chance.
Somebody just stumbles across the right spot.
And that happens. That happens from time to time. I mean, you and I have both worked in a newsroom where, you know, whether it's a hunter, you know, a sheep herder, somebody out just exploring, you know, in a Jeep or whatever, those discoveries do happen from time to time, and would sure love to see something like that happen here.
Anything you can tell me about episode 5?
That I haven't spoiled already? I feel like I gave it all away.
You gave away some good stuff, I thought.
No, I mean, episode 5 is so dense because now we've kicked off the investigation, right? You are starting to see the wheels of the investigative machine turn, and more resources start getting thrown at this case. You start seeing Josh take some very interesting steps to protect himself. And in the next few episodes, I think there's a lot of detail about where he was at particular times, about what police knew when, that people will be surprised to learn.
We hear Theresa Powell's voice in the 911 call in this most recent episode. Did you ever get a chance to talk to her?
You know, interesting you asked that question. I had a chance to talk to her just this week. You know, Theresa has kept, I think, a pretty low profile. She's been somewhat alienated from most of the surviving family, and my sense is that this whole experience is still very traumatic for her. I don't want to speak for Theresa, but she expressed a desire to not be interviewed and explained that she has not sought out any attention. She doesn't want to be involved in any media surrounding the case.
There are a few other new characters that we meet in this episode that I haven't asked you much about, in addition to Detective Maxwell. For example, Giovanna,
yeah,
the lady who came over to have that pancake lunch with the Powells. How did you meet Giovanna? How did you find out about her?
Yeah, so you know, some of the folks who were involved very early on with kind of the events of the first few days, they shared their stories publicly to reporters, or you know, they've been referenced in documents. You know, Kirsty Hellewell, Debbie Caldwell, some of these people, they've been kind of the face of Susan's friends and family. Giovanna, maybe a little less so. She has not sought out the attention. I didn't actually personally interview her. That was a member of our team who did that interview. But I think some of the things that she shared about her observations of the way Josh was acting that day, and her perception of him being, you know, this attentive husband, you know, shows that he was acting out of character, because everybody else describes Josh very, very differently. So those observations, you know, even with everything that I'd seen from, you know, Giovanna's transcripts of her interviews with police and things, hearing her describe that in her own words, I thought was pretty compelling.
Anything else that you wanted to add that I haven't asked you today?
Boy, you know, we get asked a lot about how we're handling some of these religious overtones or even overt references to the church, and I'll say it here again, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Certainly when I started putting this together, using the terms Mormon and LDS, were not frowned upon by that organization. After I had done a lot of primary scripting, that was changed. And, you know, I'll be upfront in saying that I work for a company, KSL, which has chosen to respect the request of the church to use that identification on first reference. And so you will hear that in the podcast. We also reached out to folks from outside of the church to get their input on what do we need to describe to make some of the religious stuff make sense to somebody who's not familiar. So it's an ongoing effort to try to balance being respectful to the organization, inviting to a listener who doesn't know all of this, and ultimately respecting Susan's faith and her interaction with her church. And if there's any criticism to be leveled on how that's coming out, it comes directly at me, and it's a work in progress.
I have seen some people ask us why so much focus on the faith, but I think that goes back to it was really important to Susan.
Yeah, it was, absolutely. And I will defend including that in the podcast 100%. You cannot tell Susan's story and not include her feelings about her religion, because, I titled episode 3 Faith and Finances for a reason. Her religion was so important to her. And you see that her husband, her father-in-law, a lot of the people who she's interacting with are actively trying to undercut that. And she has friends and family who are trying to prop up and help her in feeling like she's empowered to practice her own religion. So yeah, absolutely, that has to be part of the story.
And speaking of part of her story, we've felt very strongly that it was really important to include domestic violence resources in every single episode, in every web story that we do. So we would just like to extend that message again here. If you or someone you know recognizes yourself or someone else in Susan's story, please get help. There are some great free resources that are available both here in Utah where we are and nationwide. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, 100%. We've heard already from people who have told us that Susan's story has helped them recognize things in their own lives or in the lives of loved ones that are concerning to them. Abuse doesn't have to result in homicide for it to be unacceptable. I think any form of domestic abuse should be confronted and stopped wherever possible, safely. And those resources are there to help people do that. We include the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You can also go to the website, thehotline.org, for information. If you're in Utah, we've partnered with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition to try to help spread that message as well.
All right. Other than that, please go give us a listen. Subscribe if you can. Leave us a rating and a review.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you listening, and we'll do this again.